Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for your kind recognition, and thank you to Princeton for throwing an awesome tournament so far. Thank you, of course, to our true friends inside Opera. I'm sure it's going to be an awesome op to our case. We are proud to stand in firm support of the resolution that this House believes that democracy is not the answer. Therefore, our models is as follows. We believe that judges should not be subject to direct election by the people in any case. Generally, we believe they ought to be appointed for life. Obviously, we'll have the usual caveats about fraud, psychological incompetence, etc., to remove them from office if necessary. We think that any sort of mechanism besides direct election is acceptable. Executive appointment with a legislative check, recommended by a local bar association, whatever. We just want to remove the democratic process from influencing what judges are on the bench. 3 independent points why we believe this is so. The first independent point focuses on the nature of the legislature versus the nature of the judiciary. Generally, within a democracy, we have a legislature there to express the democratic preferences of the people. And this is generally enshrined in the form of laws, in the form of ordinances, so that people's goals about how their values want to be expressed can be instantiated into some sort of codified law. We don't think, however, that the judiciary is in any way, shape, or form, nor should it be, an expression of democratic preference. Those on the bench should be arbiters of procedure and the application of law that has already been decided by the democratic process. There is no reason for yet another democratic process to occur where one already exists. These people are supposed to be there to be legal experts. We don't want a situation where we conflate politicians with those who are scholars of the law, scholars of jurisprudence, and those who are deciding procedural claims. We also would argue on our side of the House that separation of powers is extremely important. In order to maintain separation of powers, you need to have a judiciary that is not there to act as a secondary legislature, a competing legislature, which may in fact disagree with the legislature in many of these municipalities and many of these counties where elections actually occur. Let's get to the interesting stuff. Our second point is the idea about problems which may occur during elections. We think it's extremely clear, extremely obvious, that those who are the best politicians, those who have the most flash, the most glitz, are not necessarily the best lawyers, nor are they the best arbiters of the law. We think that's quite clear. What, however, we get in the status quo in many of these municipalities is a choice which is highly influenced by the media in each of these municipalities. We think that most people in these municipalities, before they actually vote for a judge, will not be likely to actually do the research to take a look at whether this person had a good legal education, will not do the research to see whether this person has made fair decisions in the past. We see already with elections for politicians, people are extremely influenced by how the media presents these judges. And in a way, because jurisprudence is so arcane, it is very difficult to understand for people who are not trained in the law. We think that the media is an unacceptable form of giving information to the people. No, thank you. We also think in certain municipalities, there are cases where racism may actually prevent certain people from getting to the bench, or other biases may prevent people from getting to the bench in the first place. We think that a situation where racism prevents the best possible person from arguing and for actually deciding what laws are going to be applied and when a procedural violation has occurred is not going to lead to a great legal system. Sure.
In an increasingly litigious society, is it easier to influence the laws that affect people through the legislature or through some kind of judicial means?
I think right now it seems that a lot of what was going on is people trying to influence the law through judicial means. We want to try to limit this because we find it to be inappropriate. I'm going to talk about activist judges and why they're a harm to our society a little bit later down the flow. Our fourth subpoint about problems during election focuses on who actually gets elected. It oftentimes becomes, because of the biases I've talked about, because of the media influence I've talked about, the people who have the most money, the people who have the most connections. What they need to prove on their side of the house is why it is that it is acceptable for this to serve as a proxy for jurisprudential skill. The final thing we want to talk about is trying to get the best possible people into the job. Right now, within the status quo, there may be a lot of people who would be extremely good justices, extremely great municipal court judges, who have all the legal background, all the impartiality. However, when they see that they may be elected, they see a lack of job security. They see a lack of a situation where they might have some privacy. Because people who are subject to election every 4 years are constantly within the spotlight, constantly under the eye of public scrutiny. At the point at which this disincentivizes qualified candidates from being elected to the job in the first place, we think we have an improper judiciary, one which may miscarry the law into the future. Our third independent point of analysis occurs when these people have been elected. What happens when they get elected? We think there are plenty of perverse incentives which now exist once they're on the bench in the first place. We think on our side of the house, we protect the sacred tradition in America of having an independent judiciary. We think that on either side of the house, there's going to be some sort of selection pressure to appoint certain judges. At least on our side of the house, we limit the vagaries that we get from a fully democratic system. What kind of perverse incentives are we talking about on our side of the house? First, we're talking about the idea there may be activist judges who are there to follow a particular agenda. I think there are two cases in which this can happen. The first of these is in criminal law. Many times in municipalities, tensions about somebody who has offended the values of that community can rage extremely, extremely high. So much so that procedural violations can be included. I think we need only take a look at the Duke Lacrosse rape scandal, where pressure for that DA to actually get these people in jail because of what they had done caused him to take steps which are in abrogation of the basic standards that an agent of the court should have. We imagine the same things could happen to a judge. If a judge is faced with a situation where he has to put someone in jail because of the popular will, then he may actually cease to focus on the procedural errors, cease to focus on what he's supposed to be focusing on. We think the other situation where you may see activist judges in a harm there is even if the judge isn't activist, even if the judge does all the right things. We think the simple perception that a judge may be going against what his duty or what her duty is enough to undermine confidence in the system. We have three impacts here. First, we think it's extremely bad when procedure isn't followed. This is bad because many of these procedures are designed to protect those who don't have the best legal representation, those who come under abuse by the police system. The reason why we have, for example, the removal of evidence which is obtained improperly is to disincentivize police from violating privacy or violating rights. Getting rid of procedural checks only leads to further of these violations. Our second impact is that this undermines the legitimacy of the law. If the law is now subject to the vagaries of democratic elections, it is no longer going to be seen as impartial, no longer going to be seen as something which is above and beyond what has been stated in within the law. And the final impact is the idea that this decreases faith in the legal system. If people have a perception that this is not a legal system that they can trust, that this can actually be decided, that cases can be decided by referenda instead of actual jurisprudential decisions, then that's where people start to lose faith in their government. A government without faith is one which is disconnected from its people, unable to serve its duties. For these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister for his opening remarks. Call upon the leader of opposition.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, members of this panel, and indeed everyone in this most august House. Old friend on side Gov, new friend on side Gov. Guys, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, much as I'd love to argue that democracy is a panacea and is a cure for the common cold in addition to the way Ohio State is not going to flub another postseason, we're actually going to limit what kinds of judicial elections we're going to be talking about on side opposition. Because we agree that ultimately it's probably not the best thing if the United States Supreme Court is decided by Matt Spots going to the ballot box. I'm fine with that, right? But what we would say on our side of the House is that it's actually a very active good thing to have judges at the municipal level enforcing the laws that impact people most on a day-to-day basis be actually decided by the people living under that law. We're going to explain why this is so in 4 independent points and by refuting most of theirs. So the first thing I want to talk about is justice and democracy, because they want to draw this distinction between the separation of powers. And I think that this is a fallacy that many Americans kind of tend to adopt, right? That there needs to be this necessary separation. But recognize first and foremost that this is not necessarily the case in all countries, that many countries do not have an independent judiciary. But let's say that you buy that it is separated somehow in the United States. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker and members of this panel, we would say that because they are both arms of the United States government, they are there, independent or otherwise, to serve the interests of the people. And that ultimately, the judicial branch can enforce some kind of harm against people just as surely as a legislature can, as an abusive legislature. Recognize that when people have no check of it, except through the legislature, which is a long and tedious process, especially for the people most likely to be affected by a judicial branch, we see that it's ultimately taken out of the hands of the people much more, that the judiciary becomes artificially separated, artificially detached from the people, something that Hans and I don't view as a good thing on our side of the House.
We actually agree completely that both the judiciary and the legislature should be representing the interests of the people. However, they should be representing them differently. The legislature should be there to express preferences and put them into law. The judiciary should be making sure these preferences are applied equally and fairly every single case.
But we think that having a direct check on the people who actually enforce the law on the people as such leads to the people having a better understanding of how the law is being enforced on them, having an actual mechanism to check what's going on without having to end around the entire legislative process. We think that's good, and I'm going to give more impacts on that a little bit later. The second thing I want to talk about is the influence on localities, why this is so important. Well, I think they brought up a number of different issues and other different anecdotes for why this could be the case. It's absolutely true. You could have a racist community, but it's just as true that this racist community could manage to get a racist judge appointed, that these judge could be enforcing the laws unfairly. Let's talk about the laws that actually happen most frequently, however. Let's talk about things like, enforcing traffic tickets, corporate conduct, all the very basic things that people go to a judge to day to day, week by week, month by month. People gradually accumulate a sense for what that judge is actually doing. And given that that judge is part of the community, is an integral functioning member of that community, the people have a right to depend on the judge understanding the law as it exists in the community. When people understand that, this judge is not just existing in some kind of vacuum as a part of the community, we think it's better. Another impact of this would be that they say it's actually a bad thing that this judge ultimately is going to be connected to the community, that they will be shocked and outraged by the thing that affects the community. Hence, I don't see this as a harm at all. We actually think it's good that a judge can gauge the actual impact to a community of the law that's being applied. We think that any justice system that is not responsive to the people is no system of justice at all. We think that a better system is that which is responsive, that does take into account the actual flesh and blood impacts of it, and not just some abstruse legal concepts. I'll get you a little bit later. The third thing I'd like to talk about, and oh my, is this a big one, corruption like whoa. And I think that this is something that they probably didn't preempt, and oh boy should they have, Mr. Speaker and members of this panel, because recognize that all the harms they're talking about, people lose faith in government. Things like, that's possible people. All of these things can happen just as surely when you have a political appointment. Just because somebody is well-connected politically, they get appointed to a justice system. Just because somebody happens to have influence, they get appointed judge. All of these things are harms, and I think they cause people to lose faith in government much quicker than it would be if people actually had a definite connectivity to the judge. But furthermore, we think that this means that there's a harm inflicted on the people that they have no direct control over. Whereas if you buy that a judge is bad, is not doing a good job, on our side of the house, the people can simply vote him out. On their side of the house, he's kind of stuck in the status quo when the people, if they have any recourse at all, have to vote for some congressman who's going to have to convince many other congressmen or congresswomen to get rid of the judge and eventually. We think this is terrible. Why is
We're
it?
saying on both sides of the house there's a situation where their money may help them get appointed in the first place. But on our side of the house, this doesn't continue on into the future. They don't have to be beholden to these pressures throughout their entire career.
I think if you say that it's a good thing that somebody is corrupt once and doesn't have to continually be corrupt, have to continue to influence people to continue the position, I think that's bad. At least on our side of the house, we have some kind of accountability. On their side of the house, if you get the influence once and only once, you're there for life, you're set, you're good. This is bad. Having a lifetime without accountability because you happen to be successfully corrupt once is bad. This is John Holwitz, president for life. Not good. The final thing that we'd like to talk about is the idea of popular law. And I think this is one of the most interesting points we're going to make. And I'm just going to kind of float it out there because I think it's ultimately good that people have an influence over the judiciary. The reason that things like nullification, the reason that things that all these different things we see juries do, or things that happen in the legal system where people actually depart from the letter of the law to recognize the way it actually influences, we think is ultimately a good thing on our side of the house. We're willing to take the kind of adventurous stance that the law should not just be something that happens in ivory towers. We think that since law is something that happens in the lives of people, lives and hearts of people, that it's best that the law actually reflect that on the ground. The best way we can do that is make sure that the judges are beholden to the people in some meaningful and tangible way, and are not simply beholden to the law degree they got so long ago. Let's go case-side. Because I think a lot of their impacts are not really going to be unique to their side of the house, and in fact, I think are going to be even worse on their side of the house. The first thing they talked about is the separation of powers and how they're supposed to be arbiters of law. I buy that, Mr. Speaker. I buy that in general. But recognize that we're not replacing the courts of appeals on our side of the house. We're not replacing the Supreme Court on our side of the house. We can still have people who are objective arbiters of law who go through this kind of vetting process at the highest levels. Recognize that municipal-type judges, which is what we're talking about on our side of the house, would probably not go through anywhere near as rigorous a vetting process as they would like to imagine a Supreme Court would on their side of the house. Because of that, Mr. Speaker, members of this panel, we think that bad judges, are going to slip through the cracks much more. Therefore, the concept of having lifetime appointments is not going to be well recognized by them. The second thing they talk about is election irregularities, and the best politicians are going to be the most influential, and that you're going to have any number of harms that come to this. Yeah, this is probably true, but I'm going to say that they're going to buy the same harms on their side of the house because they have a one-time appointment. There could be the same kind of irregularities, the same kind of connections that get a person voted in just once. Racist people can still be put in because that was the example they get. Unfortunately, on their side of the house, they're stuck with a mechanism that keeps them there forever. They're stuck with a mechanism that put them there in the first place with absolutely no recourse to the people who are going to have to live under it. This seems absurd to me in any kind of democratic framework. And they say that we want to get the best possible people. They say, maybe in the status quo we can do something this. Yeah, well maybe in the status quo this would work, maybe in the status quo this is bad, or maybe it's good. What I'm going to say on their side of the house is that the permanency they're talking about, the hypotheticals they're talking about, are just as likely, if not more so, to be corrupted by a political process, by special interests, by all the things that have influenced appointments in the status quo. The third and final point is perverse incentives. That we want an independent judiciary, and we want to fight corruption and activism and undermining legitimacy. The best way to undermine legitimacy is to put a judge in there who's going to govern the basic day-to-day lives of people. Somebody who has no connectivity to the people, no accountability to the people, who went through a one-time vetting process because, hey, he was a municipal judge, what do we care anyway? I think they're undermining justice and faith in justice far more on their side of the house. I want to hear why not. We have those.
Thank the leader of opposition for his opening remarks. On the member coming to speak.
All right, thanks a lot, everybody. So the first thing we hear from side opposition is that this is about justice and democracy. They first say that we don't really need to have an independent judiciary. Like this is, first of all, note that this isn't actually an argument for their side. It's more just like a statement. They don't get any offense out of this. They say the judiciary is there to serve the interests of the people. But I think they fundamentally misunderstand what basically the entire point of our case is. The judiciary is there to serve as a check against these other two parts of the government. They're there to sort of make sure the law is implemented fairly. What we say is they can't actually serve the interests of the people at large. They can't serve the interests of the municipalities of the country, whatever, when they don't actually apply the law fairly. The thing is that on their side of the house, they're much more likely to not apply the law fairly. This is the point that we've been bringing up, and I don't think they actually want getting into all of Alan's third independent point, where he goes at length about why this is necessarily the case. This goes almost completely cold drop. I don't think they're going to be able to dig their way out from under this, right? They talk about people are going to be able to, and the next thing they talk about in their first point is like people are going to be able to understand, like they're going to really be able to understand how these justices are. Like remember the point that Alan tells you that goes completely dropped. It's that the media is the one that are actually going to be winding up making these decisions for these people because the people are not actually going to have the time to investigate each of these individual judges. Recognize that judges are often appointed, like the elections take place en masse. There are a whole lot of people. They don't get the same sort of spotlight as the actual politicians that are running for these offices. That means that basically what a certain media entity, particularly the local district, says is basically what the people are going to vote by. The thing is, what we tell you is these media often have entrenched interests that might not be the same as the people, that might not be the same as the legislature, that might not be the same as ensuring equality under the law. At the point where you basically have the media determining which judges wind up getting elected, you buy all the harms that they're talking about and all that they've been complaining about throughout the time. They don't actually respond to this point. I'm interested to see what the MO has about this. The next thing they talk about is how this is an impact on locality. This is basically a defensive point. Like, you say you get racist judges anyways. Like, what we tell you is that you probably get fewer on our side of the house because we think there's a much greater check on politicians, particularly from there's a much greater check on politicians to not be racist than like on the actual people within a district to not be racist because the politicians have to interact with other politicians from other places outside their own district in many cases, so they can't afford to be seen as racist. But the people living within a district don't actually have the same sort of pressure. You do wind up with that on their side of the house. I don't think that just claiming this sort of thing and claiming it's not unique isn't enough. They need to give you some analysis they didn't actually give you. It's problematic for this. They say there's a need for a judge to understand community law. I think we have more than sufficient checks on our side of the house. If a judge doesn't actually follow the law, like there are procedures for getting them out of office. Like if they're really racist, they can be like disbarred and things like that. These are all possibilities that exist. We think they're sufficient. They need to give us a reason why these sorts of checks are insufficient instead of simply claiming, oh, these checks are insufficient. We think that they certainly are. We think they certainly work in the vast majority of cases. This is important, right? The third thing they talk about is like corruption. And basically this is another big defensive point for them. They're like, it's completely non-unique, guys. Okay, a number of responses. First we tell you is that it's a lot less for the reasons that I already outlined, about how there's different pressures on legislators, how there's much more pressure on legislators to be fair given their interactions with other people outside of their own constituents. What's more, what we tell you is that we need to recall that there's still these opportunities to get rid of these people, like the bar, like, you know, we don't think, insofar as this is not a unique point for their side of the house, we still get to flow a lot of our offense across that we're getting with this vote. Remember also that, insofar as these people might be corrupt, even if there's a possibility that, who knows, maybe these people in this district like this person being corrupt, maybe they like this guy's corrupt decisions, they get reelected on their side of the house. But the point is that people are going to be less willing to go through these sorts of impeachment procedures, they're going to be less willing to, I'll take a second, to use these other procedures when they feel that this judge is so popular because he keeps getting reelected. We don't want to use these procedures on him because it's going to hurt our political ability in the future. We get rid of this on our side of the house. This is important. They actually wind up giving an opportunity to these corrupt judges to stay in place. We don't like that one little bit. The final thing they talk about is that people need influence within their societies. Another completely non-offensive point. They don't have any offensive ground on this. What are we going to tell you? We think that being able to elect legislators and being able to elect, like, the executive is certainly enough of a way to actually get this sort of influence within society. We think this is really important. Yeah, sure.
Do you think the municipal judges that we've been talking about on our side of the house really serve as a check against the executive branch?
Like, this doesn't have to do anything with your point whatsoever. We think to an extent that it does. We think maybe not be as much of an extent as an appeals court, but definitely when the law and the interests of the executive branch conflict, the municipal judges do have the ability to say, this is what the law says, the executive branch has to follow. We do get a sort of check like that. But that's your fourth point, which is has like no offense whatsoever. They say people need influence. They already have sufficient influence. But what's more, it doesn't mean we should actually contradict the idea that we do need to have an effective legislator just to give people more influence. We're on our side, we're saying we should preserve the law, even if it means a little bit less influence for people within their communities. We think this is important. We think that people have enough influence already. I don't think they're getting much offense off of this. With that said, let's go back to case. So we talk about the nature of the legislature and how the legislature, there already are sufficient avenues to express the will of the people, and they don't really respond to this. What they do respond to is analysis about the separation of powers is important, and now it's important not to have a second legislature because it winds up giving contradictory outcomes, and this is something that we're not interested in, right? What they say is, oh no, we're not talking about the appeals court here, but recognize that local courts do have quite a bit of influence on local laws. We think this is the case. They say the vetting process is sufficient on their side of the house. But remember all that analysis I gave you about media, right? And why there's a perverse incentive for media, which are actually the people that are going to wind up determining which of these issues are. The check on them is not nearly as much as it is against legislators. No, thank you. We think this is important. We think they should have addressed it in the LOC, but they did not. The second thing we talk about are problems during elections, right? And we say that politicians aren't really good for the bench. And what they come is like, oh, you know, once again, it's all non-unique. We have some sort of like, you know, we have the same sort of problems raised. No, they fundamentally misunderstand the point. The sort of people that are going to be running for these sorts of things, the people that are actually interested in winding up being elected, the people that are going to subject themselves to this sort of public scrutiny are a very different class of people than many of the people that make the best judges. The thing about this is that you wind up getting politicians themselves on the bench, people that are interested in playing political games rather than necessarily enforcing the law in the best way. We think this is problematic because we think that politicians should be in the legislature and be in the executive. We think that judges and legal scholars should be on the judicial branch. We think this is pretty clear. We think we do provide a much more of a sufficient check against racism for the reasons that I already gave you. I think they need to respond to that analysis a little bit better. Alan goes on, continue, right? And he gives you some really nice analysis, right? He tells you about why certain people aren't going to want to be judges on their side of the house. People that are uniquely qualified because they're subjected to additional political scrutiny and because there's a perception of a lack of job security. And how these are the sort of people that we need to have on the bench because they're the people that are probably going to be the best legal scholars. But all of these sorts of people are not interested in actually being on the bench because of these additional pressures they're subjected to. We think it's highly problematic when we create a situation where some of the best legal minds don't want to serve on the bench because they're subjected to these pressure. This point goes dropped, it's problematic. The one response to our entire second point were problems of corruption, cross-apply everything that I've already said. I think it's more than sufficient to be this way. The final thing we talk about are perverse incentives after the election. And Alan gives you all these sweet impacts, and he gives you all this sweet analysis. And basically they say, the one response that Spots gives is, there's like no accountability to the people, this is really bad. But what we tell you is there's sufficient accountability to the people because they still get to elect their legislators and they still get to elect the executive branch. The entire point goes dropped. That means we get a flow across all these really bad impacts that they have, like procedure is not as likely to be followed, that it undermines the legitimacy of the law, and it decreases the faith in the legal system. We say this is all unambiguously bad. We're proud to propose.
Thank you, members of government. Call upon the member of opposition. opposition, you get the final constructive speech around and proceed in the next hearing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the discussed panel. I've enjoyed myself immensely at Princeton. Good friends on side opposition, or side government rather, for a very spirited case. Spots, he's one of my best friends, and I've had a wonderful time debating with him. That being said, I think what this round basically boils down to is this idea of what's the best method or what's the best mechanism by which we can change like corrupt judges. Because I think that a lot of the analysis basically comes down to the point of if in fact you assume some level of corruption, what is the best way to change it? I think at the end of the day, Spots and I have presented a very clear plan by which we can say, like, look, the only method by which you can actually change these particular judges is by doing it this particular way. Because if you assume some level of corruption, you had no opportunity ever to change it on their side of the house. I think this will be immensely clear as I go down the flow. The first point we talked to you about is the idea of an independent judiciary, right? And we said how, like, laws necessarily must serve, like, the interests of the people. So in an instance when you need to rectify laws because they don't serve these particular interests, we necessarily need the checks. Why does our check provide, like, the best benefit? Why? Because we do it in not only the most direct method, but we do it in a method that doesn't go through the legislator, which oftentimes is problematic because of the fact that most of the time, like, you know, if these legislators are corrupt, they're necessarily, like, you know, appealing to things such as, like, special interest groups and things of that nature. And number two, most of the time these processes are necessarily slow, necessarily tedious for these particular individuals. No. The first response that we hear is the idea that the judiciary must make sure that laws are implemented in a fair manner. I think Spots gets up on a POI and responds to this quite clearly because he says, like, do you think municipal judges necessarily, like, have this particular check that you actually, like, you know, espouse on the macro level of, you know, like, the branches of government? I don't think it's necessarily the case. Insofar as we frame this round on a municipal level, they're necessarily dealing with issues such as, like, divorce law, you know, like, like traffic regulation and things of that nature. Insofar as these are rather the particular issues that they're dealing with, I don't think that they necessarily get all of the things that they talk about. But moreover, what we tell you on our side of the house is like, look, if in fact there is a situation where some corrupt judge somewhere is simply in power and not being voted out of power, well, you still have, like, you know, the higher levels of court, right? You still have the appellate and the Supreme Court, which we necessarily posited at the beginning of our case, which these particular individuals are still going to be independent of any sort of voting system. But the next point they talk about is the idea of understanding enforcement, right? And we talk about how, like, look, bad judges necessarily can be selected by bad legislators just as easily on their side of the house. Thus, judges ought to place emphasis on the laws as they impact those who are affected. I think this is the heart of our case. The response that we hear is that media makes judgment for the people. The reason why this is necessarily problematic, because voters necessarily are always going to be influenced by the media. Well, let's talk about, like, on their side of the house, what people are necessarily going to be influenced by, or what judges are going to be influenced by. They're necessarily going to be influenced or put into power by, you know, legislators who are necessarily, like, going to be moved by special interest groups and things of that nature. At the end of the day, on our side of the house, we're the only side that actually provides you with any measure of accountability. Why is that? Because on their side of the house, they can never ensure any sort of accountability because of the fact that these particular legislators, number one, you can't ensure that these legislators are not being, you know, like, biased because of some special interest group. But number two, we do it in an immediate level, a level that impacts the people who the laws are actually affecting. I think this is important. The second response that we hear is that rectifying this problem is, you know, like, is better when it's done through the legislator, right? The legislator is necessarily a check. Cross-apply what I told you before. Like, you know, like, first of all, the issue of visibility on their side of the house is something that's huge. Because, you know, like, bad candidates, you know, that are elected by, you know, like, the legislator, like, simply slip through the cracks on their side of the house. So therefore, what you have is another situation where these people are stuck with, you know, like, a bad judge, or maybe a judge that doesn't influence their power, that doesn't, like, reflect their particular viewpoints, or doesn't enforce the law in a way that positively impacts them, but they can't do anything to change it. I think this is necessarily important. The third point we talked to you about is the idea of harms. And we say that judges use influence, etc., to be elected. And to ensure accountability, we need a direct way to influence them. The response that we hear is that people may like corrupt judges, and the legislator will be unwilling to change due to popularity. Look, if they're going to use this argument, fine. Let's assume corruption. At the end of the day, the judges on their side are still going to be there because of the fact that there's no way to change it. I I mean, like, they keep going on and on without addressing this fundamental problem in their case. And insofar as they don't address it, I don't think they can actually rectify this to begin with. Please.
Anthony tells you that if a judge is truly corrupt, if he's violating the law, there are ways to remove him. We call these impeachment, we call these disbarment. This is non-unique on either side of the
Right, but these ways all depend on the legislator actually taking the particular action. These ways always depend on other people besides the people being directly impacted to actually change this. And insofar as these particular individuals, you know, like they have no other recourse, I don't think that you can actually make this particular claim. I think it's abundantly clear. The fourth and final point we talked about is the idea that, you know, like, you necessarily need to check because people are necessarily influenced by the laws. Like, they basically say, like, this point has no offense, they already have sufficient influence. I don't think that they've necessarily proven the case, especially since on their side of the house, the legislator can be just as corrupt as, you know, as the process that we're advocating. At the end of the day, accountability is the best way to decide. Let's go back case side. The first point they talk about is the idea of the nature of the legislator. And they say that legislators should be arbiters, and there needs to be, like, separation of power. We say, like, look, we maintain objectivity on our side with higher courts to begin with. So all of their points about, like, corruption go to the wayside at the point at which we still have, at the end of the day, this safety valve to actually appeal to. But moreover, to solve for the problems of corruption that they actually talk about, you need a direct method by which you can actually influence the corruption. Who better than the people themselves, who the laws are being influenced by, to actually solve for this particular corruption? I don't think they actively dealt with this. Like, I mean, like, you know, they basically poo-poo this argument, but I think at the end of the day, municipal judges, you know, like, they barely place checks that they're advocating on their side on a macro level, as I said before, right? Like, it's not like they're going to change, like, you know, like, laws on a macro level. We're talking about laws on a, like, smaller level, and I think this is important. The second problem they talk about is the idea of problems with voting in general, because they talk about it allows for unfair practices, people get elected for the wrong qualifications. Look, at the end of the day, like Spots tells you, problems exist, but the mechanism they offer doesn't necessarily solve for these problems. At the end of the day, it actually aggravates these problems because there's no way to change on their side of the house. It keeps people in. They say people who run are in a different class than those. Like, first of all, this argument necessarily assumes that just because you're good at running for an election means that you're not a good judge. I don't think that they can necessarily make this claim. But number two, the process of vetting judges won't be as rigorous on their side of the house, and I think this is problematic. The third point they talk about is that you need the best people in jobs, right? And they say that people are disincentivized to become judges due to public scrutiny. First of all, like, you know, this is like an independent justification. I don't think this is why this is actually better. I think Spot outlines different points as to why this is wrong. But they talk about perverse incentives, right? And they say, like, look, judges, because of political pressures, are forced to conform to, you know, like, popular actions, and this undermines confidence in, you know, the particular judicial system. Spots articulates beautifully. Look, legitimacy is only achieved by a measure of accountability. That's the only time when you'll have people actually believing this. They say, like, you know, these additional pressures are still going to exist. There's still going to be perverse incentives to, like conform to this particular political pressure. Look, at the end of the day, if you don't have any measure of accountability, the political pressures that they're going to experience, that they necessarily will experience on their side of the house, far outweigh any pressures that we're going to have on our side of the house. We say at the end of the day, you need some measure of accountability because these people are the ones being influenced. On their side of the house, they have no way to actually change this because of the fact that their legislator is always going to be influenced. For all these reasons, we're proud to uphold
Of course, thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of this panel, and indeed everyone. And since I didn't mention it before, Princeton, for what's truly been a sterling tournament. Mr. Speaker, members of this panel, I basically just have two questions to kind of explore in this rebuttal. But I think at the end of the day, it's abundantly clear that we get any number of benefits on our side of the house that they just don't get. That their system of lifetime appointments, when applied inappropriately to local issues, certainly leads to any number of corruptions and lacks the remedies that we expect. The first question I ask is, who actually gets the best judges in this particular system? Because they're absolutely right? Like, their case is essentially no voting because corruption might happen. And indeed, they're correct. It's very likely that any kind of government has the potential for corruption. I think it would be kind of facile for anybody to deny it, and any of us could explore ad nauseum why it is that corruption comes about. The intriguing thing, however, is that they've actually carved out a number of checks that people have. And checks not only in general, but checks that people have on the law that is enforced on them at the most local level, at the most important level to most people. So yes, they're correct. A judge could be elected. People could make a bad decision. Happens all the time in democracies. I don't really think that they've done anything to make it better on their side of the house. Because the people, that these stupid people who are voting for judges, they're voting, the congressmen that these same stupid people elected are making the decision on their side of the house. That's a problem if they posit the people are stupid to begin with. But furthermore, when you elevate it beyond the people, you buy a whole host of new problems. What kinds of problems am I talking about? Well, maybe people are stupid, but I think special interest groups are incredibly powerful at the congressional level. That the law that is going to be enforced in people at the lowest level is going to be driven by the special interest groups that drive Congress and not the average Joe Schmo who decides how good a judge is because he happened to be there for a divorce proceeding or a traffic ticket. We think that these checks are going to be good at the local level. But on their side of the house, they say, wait, we can solve corruption. Why can we solve corruption? Because we can disbar them. I have two responses that Hans articulated rather brilliantly. The first and foremost is these are municipal judges we're talking about. Do you really think that the local bar association has the time to vet out or sort out every single little corrupt municipal judge? But even if that's the case, it's not unique to their side of the house. We just get an extra set of them. I don't recall Hans and I ever articulating that we were getting rid of the bar association, getting rid of impeachment proceedings. In fact, I quite clearly said we're going to keep all of these and have the additional check of understanding what the judge actually does in the courtroom from the people who see him in the courtroom. I think it's abundantly clear that we get all the checks that they're talking about and more without the process. What is the only thing they're doing? They're not really pushing the accountability, making the accountability better. They're just pushing it up, making it a singular event that the people have no control over, that costs people faith in government, costs people faith in what's actually going on in the system, far more than ever happens on their side of the house. I think that's a problem. But the second thing is, why is it better to have elected local judges? Why can these local judges do a better job? Well, we think ultimately it's better that judges have an idea of the ramifications upon the community. Make no mistake about it. He can get up all he wants and talk about the judiciary as a check against the executive and legislative branches, but that clearly doesn't happen in any substantive way at the municipal level. The important things that go on are the things that understanding what happens day to day. And do we want ivory tower scholars running all the municipal proceedings? No. When I have somebody in there with a divorce case, I'd rather have someone who's lived as a regular person with these regular people, who understands the community's standards. All these little things that happen in the municipal branch are better handled by someone who's part of the community, not someone from some legal school, law school, who happens to be dropped into a situation that they don't understand. We get better law, better enforcement, and less corruption on our side of the house, all of which I think substantiates an opposition ballot. We're strongly proud to oppose.
Opposition for his remarks on the Prime Minister. The Honorable Barbara Speaker Rand, not to exceed 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to Anthony for an awesome speech, and thank you to our friends on side off for what I think was an excellent op to our case. Two questions, and the first is weighing corruption. How do we compare the corruption which occurs on both sides of the House? I say all the way back in PMC that we have the balls to admit that in both cases there is going to be some corruption. Some unfortunate shit is going to occur during these appointment processes. Why is it better on our side of the House? First, on our side of the House, it is going to be mitigated because of the vetting process. At least on our side of the House, you have a bar association or you have the legislature looking into this person's legal background. On their side of the House, they depend on individual citizens to take time out of their lives to do this. I think this is highly, highly unlikely. So the first point you weigh on is vetting process versus no vetting process. We also talk about the idea of having a better incentive for good lawyers, good judges who may be a little bit shy, who don't like playing political games, who don't like playing all of these sparkle games and being on the TV all the time. And I think Anthony really brings this point home. They never give us any analysis as to why these people will still run for office. We also talk about the idea that we put pressure on legislators to be fair and not racist. Why do we win this point hardcore? First, Anthony tells you that oftentimes if there's racism or there's corruption within an electorate, within the people who are electing a judge, it can be lost in the noise of that election. There's no one to point to and say, this individual is culpable for that corruption, this individual is culpable for that racism. Not so for a legislator. They talk about special interests, new in the MO. For example, it's very clear when a special interest group is influencing a politician. However, if that special interest group is paying for media coverage, is paying for flyers to go to the individual people, this goes undetected. There is no substantive check. Also, even if you don't buy any of that, say there's corruption on both sides of the House. Corruption is going to be far worse on their side because the extension of this harm exists into the future. At least we get corruption at the outset, but on their side of the House, their very job security is tied to depending on the special interest group for every single election. Every 2 years, every 4 years, they get a repetition of this corruption. We find that to be unacceptable. They say that people are better than the vetting process, however curtailed such a process might be. We've given you analysis to show how people are influenced by the media in unfair ways. People don't understand whether somebody is a scholar, a legal scholar, who is capable of making correct decisions. Then we hear no response as to why this is not the case. Now, we say that if somebody is truly corrupt, they're either going to be impeached by the legislature or disbarred by their peers within a bar association. We give you 2 checks. Now, Matt gets up here in rebuttal and says, no, we get this on our side too. Guys, that was my point. We're saying that when corruption occurs, there's a check on either side. This is a red herring that does not exist in the round at all, or ought not to exist in the round. Second area of crystallization. How ought the judiciary serve the interests of the people, and how ought the legislature serve the interests of the people? Matt concedes in LOC that there ought to be some sort of separation of powers. So the question in this debate round must be, how should this separation of powers actually be borne out? We have argued in our side of the House that preferences ought to be expressed via the legislature. This is why we see a huge range of state and municipal laws which are completely discordant because they reflect community standards. I say this in PMC, we say this is a sufficient expression of political preferences shown by the people. We never hear any analysis as to why we needed an extra expression of these preferences. I already give you a reason why people's preferences will be shown. Now, we also talk about cases where it's going to be a check against the executive branch. And then they say, no. These municipal judges never, ever check the executive branch. First of all, in case construct, I said not just municipal judges, all judges should be like this. But let's say I don't want to be a douchebag and just talk about municipal judges. The fact is that municipal judges do take a look at illegal search and seizure times, when you have illegal stops by local police officers. They also look at cases where people are being read their Miranda rights or not. The reason why we have these procedural checks is to make sure that rights violations don't occur in the first place. Because police know that in order to get a conviction, they need to abide by these laws. If, however, as on their side of the House, they know that a judge may actually go with anything the people want, they may be more likely to do the popular thing, even if the popular thing means some sort of abridgment of rights. We believe that the judiciary should be there to interpret and fairly apply the law. On their side of the House, they have a judiciary who has to say, I'm feeling like the people want to bend the law a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and bend the law. I think that's unacceptable. They hand wave and talk about accountability. But accountability has to be proper accountability. We don't think that we get fair application on their side of the House because procedural decisions are linked to job security, and we think that is completely unacceptable. Sometimes the correct technicality, sometimes the right decision is not the most popular one. And if they're accountable to people who are making a popular but incorrect, illegal decision, that's a situation where you get a miscarriage of the law. The only check is we've got to maintain objectivity in higher courts. This seems absurd. Let's maintain that objectivity from the first instance. We propose.